Hey there, everyone. My name is Robert McKnight, and today I'm going to be talking to you about heavy metal music from the 1980s. So, just to start off, what is it? Heavy metal, it's a genre of music that, of course, still exists today. It's basically characterized by a fast tempo, virtuosic guitar, usually long solos, aggressive percussion, and operatic vocals. Although there are some genres of heavy metal music that use more lower, growly vocals. It's rooted in hard rock from the 1970s. Hard rock was a subgenre of rock and roll that was characterized by a distorted guitar tone, steady percussion, and rough vocals. And we see some of those same characteristics in heavy metal music, but just sort of taken to a further extreme. 1970s hard rock bands like Deep Purple, Led Zeppelin, Budgie, Atomic Rooster, Uriah Heep, Blue Cheer, AC/DC, Motorhead, Kiss, Rainbow, so many others. They really set the groundwork, laid the foundations for what would become heavy metal music in the 1980s. In general, I think heavy metal music from the 1980s is still harmonically and melodically related to the blues. Um, a- Again, like I said before, it takes it sort of to an extreme or to a next level, but it's not quite at the point yet where we're totally divorced from these sorts of same melodies or harmonies. The first generation of heavy metal, if we can call it that, or at least the pioneering generation, can be found mostly in the 1970s, but there are some examples that date back even as late as the 1950s or the early 1960s. For example, artists like Link Wray, James Cotton, the guitarist Gardy Martin, who played with Marty Robbins, another guitarist Willie Kizart, who played with Ike Turner, and another guitarist Paul Burleson, who played with the Johnny Burnett Trio. These are just some examples of guitarists who used distorted or fuzz guitar tone early on, at a time when it wasn't really that common. It's sort of a tone that is now quite common to hear in heavy metal and hard rock music, as well as some of the pictures on the side. Richie Blackmore, his band Rainbow, which I mentioned on the previous slide, they were an important hard rock band from the 1970s. We can see the picture right below him of the New York Dolls from 1973, quite a little bit before 1980s metal, but their look, you can see how they're dressed, their attire, that would really um, be be copied by glam metal bands from the US in the 1980s. And then the picture on the side there of Paul Di'Anno and Steve Harris of Iron Maiden from 1980, they sort of represent British, new wave of British heavy metal bands. Um, they were really at the forefront of that movement. So what we kind of see in in these pictures is there are two main camps of heavy metal music that's sort of starting to emerge in the late 1970s, early 1980s. On one side of the Atlantic in Britain, you have these Nawabum bands, the new wave of British heavy metal, and on the other side, in the USA, you have glam metal groups. There are some similarities between the two, but then also some important differences. One of the most striking ones we can see visually perhaps right away on this slide is how they're dressed. The New York Dolls echoing or sort of pre-echoing what would be the glam metal movement. That sort of visual attire looks totally different from how Di'Anno and Harris look in Iron Maiden, almost sort of more like American punk musicians. Black Sabbath is arguably perhaps the first heavy metal band. They released their debut album in 1970, and although, like I mentioned on the previous slide, there are some earlier examples of heavy metal music, or at least qualities that appeared in popular music that would later be normal for heavy metal. Black Sabbath is probably the first band that actually created their music as horror music. They thought that if people like horror movies, if they're willing to read horror literature, why not? Why wouldn't people be interested in horror music as well? So the album cover features dark, foreboding imagery, sort of this not very nice morning, kind of overcast weather with sort of this ghostly pale woman dressed in black standing in front of this lonesome house. The music itself often features lyrics about the occult or dark subjects. Um, The title track, Black Sabbath, uses an extremely dissonant tritone interval, G and C sharp, probably the most dissonant interval that you have in music. Even the name of the band itself, Black Sabbath, was taken from a horror movie. Critics and media associated the band with Satanism, which was an element or an element that would become popular, quite commonplace with other heavy metal bands going forward into the future. Although Black Sabbath didn't consider themselves Satanists or even heavy metal, um, that was sort of a label that was applied to them. And I'm not going to play the music because um, I'm just going to go through the slides, but the links are there at the bottom for anyone to listen to. So moving into the 1980s, when we start to see an actual real movement of many bands subscribing to a similar aesthetic, the main movement that we see in Britain going on is this Nua movement, the new wave of British heavy metal. And this is sort of represented by bands like Iron Maiden, Saxon, Judas Priest, Praying Mantis, Dio, Blitzkrieg, Ostrogoth, Grim Reaper, Sweet Savage, and of course many, many more. Some of the pictures I have here on the side, you can see some of those bands. The picture at the top right, it's another picture of early Iron Maiden. Steve Harris is in the middle, who we saw on the previous slide, but then also their two guitarists, Adrian Smith on the left and Dave Murray on the right. A common feature of many of these British new wave heavy metal bands was have twin lead guitars. So usually both guitarists taking a solo too in the song, usually making the songs a little bit longer than your average pop song. Judas Priest was famous for riding a motorcycle on stage. That was sort of a big stunt that they used to do. And so that's a picture of Rob Halford there. And a lot of the attire that these heavy metal bands would wear, leather, studs, chains, that tend to overlap as well with American biker culture. I also mentioned American punk culture on the previous slide. There was a lot of transatlantic cultural exchange still going on, even in the 1980s, which of course can be dated back musically to the British invasion of the 1960s, which of course was rooted even earlier in generations before. So typical Nawabin music, it featured distorted guitars, usually twin lead, like I said. It often used power chords in the rhythm section. So instead of playing the chords on the guitar in standard position, you would play just the root, the octave, and the fifth. It often featured wailing vocals. So these sort of gruff, rough vocals, that wasn't very common in Nawabin bands. Iron Maiden's first singer, Paul Di'Anno, he sort of had more like a punk approach to singing. But Bruce Dickinson, when he joined the band in their third album, he really brought that operatic wailing sense style to their music. There's usually a fast tempo and catchy melodic hooks with Nawabin band songs. You can see some popular albums as well on the right, the bottom right there. The top right, or excuse me, the top left, Iron Maiden's Number of the Beast, Saxon's debut album right beside it, Judas Priest Screaming for Vengeance below, and then in the bottom corner, Ostrogoth's Ecstasy and Danger. Some of the, or at least one of the interesting things I think about the album artwork here is all the literal metal on the cover, with Saxon, Judas Priest, Ostrogoth. Um, Pretty much the entire cover is literally metal. The hawk, the scorpion are made out of metal. The sword is front and center, taking up most of the cover, as well as the shield. There's maybe some level of violence. The blood on the sword. The scorpion certainly represents danger, as seen in the title. The hawk screaming for vengeance. It's a bit hard to tell, but I think it has missiles attached to the wings, and it certainly looks like it's doing a dive bomb attacking for it. Some sort of occult symbolism, satanic imagery, devil representation, crosses is also quite common, which we can see on the Iron Maiden cover. There's a picture of the devil being controlled by Iron Maiden's mascot Eddie. So these sorts of aesthetic was influenced by shock rock acts of the 1970s. Acts like Alice Cooper, for example, or Black Sabbath, like I mentioned before. It was quite commonplace for them to use as well set pieces or to have shocking artwork associated with their music. And there's a link for Iron Maiden's Number of the Beast at the bottom of the page there. So glam metal in America, on the other side of the Atlantic, it was inspired by 1970s glam rock, which also had roots in Great Britain. You know, David Bowie, one of the most famous artists of the 1970s glam rock movement. But by the time we get to the 1980s, it's sort of moved over into the USA, into California, and also maybe evolved into a little bit of what would be called stadium rock. Um, we can see some pictures of glam rock artists here from the 1980s. Um, David Lee Roth, the lead singer of Van Halen, on the left there. He's pictured wearing tight spandex pants, wearing makeup, having long hair, wearing sort of that flamboyant neon shirt. That was definitely a part of the glam aesthetic. Um, and we can see sort of a similar sort of thing going on in the Twisted Sister picture up at the top right, how the guitarists are wearing makeup as well. They have long hair. And even the name Twisted Sister is a bit of a pun on the glam aesthetic, how there's this sort of cross-gender representation. Bands like Motley Crue, Quiet Riot, Twisted Sister, Def Leppard, Bon Jovi, Poison, Cinderella. These are all famous, popular glam metal groups that all had big hits. Van Halen's 1978 release, a little bit before the 1980s, but their debut is often considered a foundational release, an important landmark in heavy metal development of the 1980s in America. You can see some pictures of album art there in the lower right. Bon Jovi's Slippery When Wet, Def Leppard Hysteria, and as I mentioned already, Van Halen's debut LP at the bottom there. A lot of lyrics often about partying, sexual innuendo, wild lifestyles, drugs, alcohol, etc. A little bit different than the subject matter that was being expressed through the Nua Movement, which tended to focus maybe more on fantasy, mythology, religion, things like that. There's a link at the bottom for Van Halen's Eruption and You Really Got Me. That was one of their first big singles from their first album. Eruption, of course, showcasing Eddie Van Halen's virtuosic guitar style. His I think about a minute and a half long solo at the beginning is an introduction to their cover of the Kinks song, You Really Got Me. And he does a solo in that song too, which is well worth listening to. So moving into the 1980s, you know, all this foundation, all these different bands are moving around, touring, selling music, making or appealing to gradually larger and larger audiences. It was inevitable that heavy metal would start to go mainstream. It could no longer be an underground movement if so many people were interested in it. And in fact, heavy metal started to sell, I think between 1983 and 84, it moved up between 8 to 20% of all record sales in the United States, which is pretty extraordinary. A number of other media also developed around heavy metal to appeal to fans. So magazines, Heavy Metal Magazine, Kerrang Magazine, Metal Hammer. You can see some examples of those two magazines up at the top right and the center row there. Heavy metal was featured in movies like the Heavy Metal movie, associated with the Heavy Metal magazine, both from 1981. And then This Is Spinal Tap. You can see the poster for the band there on the left. This Is Spinal Tap was a mockumentary movie that came out in 1984. But the band has since done reunions and played shows every now and then as their characters. You can see the poster there is from 2016. Heavy metal albums started to go to #1 in Billboard sales. So Quiet Riot in 1983, their Metal Health album went to #1. Bon Jovi's Slippery When Wet in 1986. Def Leppard Hysteria in 1987. These were all big records that had lots of singles that are still even popular today. Heavy metal had music videos on MTV, and you know it was so commonplace for MTV to be playing these videos that they even made their own shows for heavy metal music videos. Heavy Metal Mania was a show that started in 1985. It was sort of followed up by the Headbangers Ball in 1987. Headbangers Ball is a really interesting show. It was actually guest hosted by heavy metal musicians, a different one every week. I have a link at the bottom here for the episode featuring Rat from 1989. And the link goes right into the Anthrax tour promo, So it's a commercial for selling tickets to Anthrax on tour. But as well, they mention a couple different albums. And so, you can just see how commonplace it was for this media to be commercialized. And it's just very interesting to see this heavy metal music represented in a way that we don't really see anymore. The picture at the very bottom there, or rather the two pictures, the one of the picture of the four girls, it's the original lineup from the band Girl School. So the band started there in 1981, and that represents heavy metal moving out to a wider demographic audience. No longer was heavy metal just being purchased and consumed by teenage boys. The original teenage audience had grown up from the 1970s, so they're now 10 years older as adults, still being interested in this new generation of music. As well, heavy metal music was starting to appeal to a more female audience. So it was becoming less of a male-dominated sphere. And you can see the picture of sort of these aging audience members in the picture on the very right there. The two guys with the jean jackets with a number of different patches, heavy metal insignia. That's again another example of the commercialization of heavy metal music, how this merchandise, or how it has been merchandised. So at the same time as heavy metal was becoming more mainstream, there was a reaction against the mainstream commerciality of heavy metal, and a number of new heavy metal groups started to splinter off into some smaller different subgenres. So for example, thrash metal, death metal, black metal, power metal, doom metal. These were all reactions against the commerciality of Nua Movement and glam. And these new artists sought a return to metal's roots as an underground movement, as something that was a little bit dangerous, a little bit subversive, a little bit rebellious. One of the bands at the forefront of that is Slayer. You can see their picture on the right there. They challenged heavy metal music at the time by playing even faster, even more dissonant, using even gorier imagery. Interestingly, some of these subgenres of heavy metal music would become more popular with time. So, giving time into the 1980s, just like the original audience of this underground movement elevated it to become a little bit more mainstream, this new underground audience of this new movement would later, again, do the same thing and elevate their movement to become a bit mainstream. But then some other genres will go the opposite direction, become even more underground and even more extreme. There was some overlap of these different subgenres, aesthetics. Most bands didn't only play one subgenre. And yeah, moving on to the next one. So thrash metal. Thrash metal is probably the subgenre of those five that I mentioned that has become the most popular. And it's popularized by, I would say, the big four main bands: Metallica, Anthrax, Megadeth, and Slayer. And Anthrax, we saw a little bit, or at least you can see a little bit from the slide before, the tour promo from MTV. Slayer, we saw their picture on the other slide, and there's a link for Raining Blood at the bottom of the page here. So Megadeth, their picture is on the top there, and Metallica, their picture is on the bottom. And it's interesting, I think, to see the stage setup of these anti-commercial bands, but they're using basically the same commercial stage setup as we see not only in other heavy metal groups, but in pretty standard rock and roll or even pop music. The use of set pieces as well. That seems pretty commercial to me. Thrash metal, it's defined by extreme speed, heavy dissonance, low register notes, and heavy percussion. Very much like the previous heavy metal that we talked about, but sort of taken to a further extreme. Musically, there's no longer an overt resemblance to rock and roll or the blues. The dissonance is no longer rooted in this pentatonic scale. One of the songs, Slayer, Raining Blood, at the bottom there. The album Rain in Blood from 1986 was a huge breakthrough album for Slayer. It really elevated them to international fame. And interestingly, I think all four of these bands, Metallica, Anthrax, Megadeth, Slayer, they had top 10 hits, album hits in the early 90s. And all of these bands, I think, have gone on to become pretty famous. Death and black metal is a little bit of a harsher subgenre or subgenres. It's darker, faster, and even more dissonant than thrash. It often uses, or they often use growling vocals, as well as abrupt time signature changes and syncopation. So bands like Venom, Celtic Frost, Slayer, Creator, Possessed, Death, which is a different Death actually from the three brothers from Detroit. Yeah, just same name. Necrophagia, Obituary, Autopsy, Morbid Angel. You can even hear in their names how dissonant and even offensive they're trying to be. Death metal was popularized in the States, while black metal was popularized in Scandinavia. I have some examples here of a couple of these bands. Cannibal Corpse um, is a death metal band from the United States. You can see their picture there at the top, and at the bottom, Gorgoroth is a black metal band from Scandinavia, somewhere in Europe. I think Sweden, possibly not though. Although American bands typically maintain that metal is a-religious, so it's just for fun. It's fantasy. There's nothing real about it or nothing real behind the music. Some European bands like Gorgoroth, in particular the band's guitarist Infernus, do claim to be genuine Satanists. And some crimes such as murder and arson were linked to Swedish black metal bands in the early 1990s. Some musicians did go to prison for crimes that they committed. Some really extreme stories from some of the groups associated with that movement. Then some bands, so these bands like Venom, Barthery, Mercy Fate, Hellhammer, Celtic Frost, Mayhem, Dark Throne, Burzum, Immortal Emperor, Satyricon, Gorgoroth. These are groups who sort of represent this aesthetic. Eventually, these two genres merged together. So some bands call themselves black death metal, although there are some bands who still maintain that these subgenres are distinct and refer to themselves only as black metal or only as death metal. There's a link here for Funeral Fog by Mayhem. This album came out, I think, actually fairly late, like 1994, but the writing for it began in 1988. And one of the reasons why it was so delayed had to do with these crimes and things that I mentioned. I think the main singer or one of the lead writers killed himself, and that delayed the release of the album for a year or two. So power metal and doom metal. Power metal, very similar to Nua Movement that we talked about from the previous slides. In contrast to what we saw with black death metal or black metal and death metal, it's defined by upbeat melodic riffs, soaring operatic vocals, and often fantastic lyrics that tell a narrative or tell a story. Bands like Halloween, Queensryche, Fate's Warning, Running Wild, Rage, Gravedigger, Blind Guardian, and Dragon Force, Iced Earth. These last two are a bit more recent, but I couldn't not include Dragon Force. They're one of the most famous bands at the forefront of power metal, pardon me, today, and they've actually been around for quite some time. Even if you're not a fan of heavy metal music or power metal music specifically, you've probably heard of Dragon Force. And so I included a link to Through the Fire and Flames at the bottom there. Just a great song, really great representation of the genre. But of course, there are some great examples from the 1980s too. Halloween's Keeper of the Seven Keys is an amazing song, an amazing album, well worth checking out. Doom metal is even still quite a bit different from all the other subgenres I've mentioned so far. So unlike a lot of what we've seen with other metal, doom metal rejected the emphasis on speed. It's all about playing slow, trance-like meditative tempos. Bands like Pagan Altar, Witchfinder, General, Pentagram, Saint Vitus, The Obsessed, Candlemass, Caius, Sleep. These are great examples of doom metal bands. I posted I copied a link to Saint Vitus's "Born Too Late." It's a 2010 performance, but the song was originally written in 1986, I think, from their third album, and it's about 10 minutes long. Notice how slow the tempo is, but still how tight the band is in their music. Really, really well coordinated. So heavy metal continued to evolve into the 1990s, just as these different subgenres splintered off in the 1980s. It didn't stay where it was, and the mainstream dominance of heavy metal music actually began to wane a little bit. MTV said, or was quoted as saying that it seemed that heavy metal music was taking up a bit too much space in all their programming and all their lineup. In order to attract a bit of a wider audience, they were going to expand their programming, which simultaneously meant diminishing heavy metal music a little bit. So in addition to the five subgenres I mentioned, there was even more niche fragmentation. Those subgenres led to more subgenres, which led to more subgenres. And eventually it just couldn't, these different subgenres couldn't attract a wide enough audience or a large enough audience to itself become mainstream again. And mainstream metal, the heavy metal music that had become popular, was becoming too anodyne, too much like pop music, becoming too far removed from what it was originally associated with in the original movement. By and large, heavy metal music was replaced, so by other new, dangerous underground genres like grunge or even hip hop was beginning to emerge as a dominant music force in the late 1980s, early 1990s. But it didn't go away entirely. So alt metal became a new popular genre in the 1990s, represented by groups like Alice in Chains or Soundgarden, for example, or nu metal, groups like Linkin Park, Limp Bizkit. These groups combined rap with metal to create new sounds, new types of pop records. And I have links to both Alice in Chains and Linkin Park's music at the bottom there. Heavy metal music today. Heavy metal music has not gone away. It still continues to be a popular, viable, influential musical genre. It's continued to evolve and grow. It's probably not taken as seriously today as it was in the past when it was in its infancy as an underground movement, rebelling against the popular aesthetics of the time. A lot of bands incorporate humor into their music, so it can be hard to tell exactly where the difference is between what's serious and what's satire. Groups like Tenacious D, for example, and I have a link there at the bottom right to their song "The Metal." That's a really interesting track, I think, because it shows how self-discursive heavy metal music has become. That it's able to comment on itself, almost that it's become meta metal in a way that other popular genres of music have. In the way that rock and roll music can comment on itself, or hip hop or jazz can comment on itself. That shows, I think, a sense of growth or sophistication or maturity in heavy metal music. There are also, of course, many non-English metal bands that play heavy metal. The group Aria, I have their picture there at the bottom right. They've been called the Russian Iron Maiden for how similar their music is to Nua music. There was a resurgence of 1980s metal music in the 2000s across all sorts of different genres and subgenres. There was a new wave of traditional heavy metal, so White Wizard, sort of trying to do the same sort of aesthetic as Nawabum. Lots of other bands associated with that as well. Neo Glam, Steel Panther. You can see their picture up at the top there. They're very much a parody of 1980s glam. And speed metal or neo thrash, groups like Skullfist, they're sort of trying to sound like Metallica or Megadeth, or early Metallica, early Megadeth. And there are new genres of metal too. Gent is a new style of metal that's recently emerged in the 2010s. It uses polyrhythm underneath technically complex palm-muted guitar chords, syncopated riffs, and virtuosic soloing. And you can see a picture from the band Periphery from 2015. They're sort of one of the pioneers leading this gent movement. So I've included credits for all the images that I used here. Everything is common license or free of copyright. And that's it. Thanks very much.